Hi everyone, hello, welcome. Hi, welcome to today's DiaTalk. My name's Alexis Lowry. I'm Associate Curator here at Dia. Is this okay? It's trained to her height, not mine, so if you can't hear me, let me know. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Anna Lovatt, who's going to be speaking about Michelle Stuart, whose wonderful work you see on view behind us here. But before we begin, I just want to thank everyone at Dia who helped make this possible. Our entire visitor services staff, but especially Daniel Oates-Kuhn, Caroline Schneider, Maria Celli, who's right there, and Kathleen Shields, our education department, Alex Vargo and Megan Mattingly, Dan Wolf, who makes sure that we can all be heard. Without them, nothing would be possible today, so thank you. But I especially want to thank Michelle for trusting us with her masterpiece and allowing us to install it in the galleries. So thank you for everything so far. Anna Lovatt is an art historian whose writings about Michelle Stuart have been, Michelle's, particularly her large-scale scrolls, have been very central to our thinking here at Dia. Lovatt's research focuses on art from the 1960s and 70s and its legacies, particularly drawing and its relationship to post-minimalism and conceptual art. In 2013, she curated the exhibition Michelle Stuart, Drawn from Nature, which traveled to several museums, including Nottingham, the Parish Art Museum, and the Santa Barbara Museum in California. And there was an accompanied exhibition catalog, which is a wonderful book, edited volume on Michelle's work, for those of you who are interested. And in it, Lovatt, in particular, highlights the sort of photographic logic of Michelle Stuart's scrolls. That is, the way in which they have a kind of indexical structure. They index the surfaces that they capture on their, that you can see here. And that kind of relationship was very important to us in terms of thinking about where Michelle's work would belong within the context of Dia's collection and how we could place it. So thank you for that. Lovatt's writing has appeared in After All, Art Forum, Art History, October, Oxford Art. I could go on, but she's a prolific publisher. And she is currently working on a monograph entitled Drawing Degree Zero, The Line from Minimal to Conceptual Art. She's the Marguerite Hoffman Scholar in Residence in the Department of Art History at the Southern Methodist University in Dallas. And before that, she's held positions at the Courtauld, University of Nottingham, and University of Manchester. So thank you for joining us. We're thrilled to have you here, and please join me in welcoming her.
Thanks very much, Alexis, and thank you for inviting me to speak here at Dia. I'm going to be referring to this small pamphlet that Dia has produced through the talk. So before we start, I just wanted to make sure everybody has one of these. It has some supplemental images of other works by Michelle that I'll be talking about today. So my talk today will focus predominantly on the work behind me, Fayetteville Strata Quartet of 1976. And this work has recently been installed here at Dia. The installation opened this May. So the work, as you can see behind me, consists of 4 vast sheets of thick muslin-backed rag paper. It's a type of thick paper sometimes used in cartography, as I'll be talking about later. And each of these sheets is approximately 5 feet by 12 feet. So it's a really monumental, imposing work. As you can see, each of them has a reddish pigment, and this pigment is created by rubbing earth from the Fayetteville quarry in New Jersey into the surface of the paper. So the earth has been smashed and rubbed into that paper surface outdoors at a quarry in New Jersey, and the paper has then been brought into the gallery space. So what I want to do today is to contextualize this particular installation in relation to Michelle's practice, but also in relation to some other works of minimal, conceptual and land art on display here at Dia. I'm delighted that Michelle is here today, and I wanted to say what a great pleasure it has been to get to know this important artist and to see her rich and innovative work on display here at Dia Beacon. So I'm going to begin with some biographical information that pertains to Michelle's artistic practice as it developed in the late 1960s and up until this point in 1976. Michelle grew up in Los Angeles, California, and her father was an engineer who mapped and surveyed water lines in California. And he would often take her as a child on his trips into the Southern California desert. And I think this imbued Michelle with an interest in travel, which we're going to see playing out throughout her career, but also obviously an interest in the landscape and in the practice of map making or cartography. Michelle then attended the Chouinard Art Institute in the early 1950s, and after she graduated, she followed in her father's footsteps to become a cartographic draftsperson. She worked for an architectural and engineering firm in California in the early 50s, and her main job for that firm was to transfer photographic images, aerial images of the landscape into drawings. So that would be done using a grid to transfer the photographic image into a drawing. It was very intricate work. It was work engaging with aerial images of the landscape. And again, as I'll discuss in a moment, we can see these interests in cartography, in the grid, and in the texture and topography of the land feeding into her practice as it developed in the late 1960s. An interesting aside is that Michelle left that job to travel to Mexico, where she worked briefly as an assistant to Diego Rivera on his Teatro de los Insurgentes mural in Mexico City. So she assisted Rivera on that major work of public art, and she has said subsequently that she doesn't consider her work to be intrinsically political, but certainly at this moment in the 50s she had an interest in political art. Later on, I'll discuss her engagement with the feminist art movement of the 70s and suggest that although the work is not necessarily political in itself, it might have been informed by her engagement with feminist politics in the 70s. So from Mexico, Stuart traveled to New York and then immediately to France, where she lived for a few years in the mid-1950s, and she then settled in New York in 1958. In New York, she took classes in anthropology, archaeology, art history, and aesthetics at the New School for Social Research. And she also began to develop the artistic practice for which she has now become known. So if you look on your handout, you'll see the first image is one of Stuart's moon drawings. These are very difficult to reproduce, so you might not be able to see the detail that clearly, but I'm going to describe these works for you because they feed into later works like the one installed here at Dia. So the moon drawings are fairly small. The one illustrated here is 15 by 19 inches, and they're made with graphite pencil. And Stuart made them working with NASA images of the lunar surface. So, of course, the moon landing took place in 1969, and a whole range of artists, including David Lamelas and Dan Graham, made works in response to the moon landing, this seismic event that had really captivated the attention of the world. Stuart's drawings were made using NASA photographs of the lunar surface and transferring those photographs into drawing with some of the techniques she'd used as a cartographic draftsperson. So the drawing is gridded. She would use the grid to transfer the image from one medium, photography, to another, drawing. It's incredibly intricate, and it represents the craters and the pitted surface of the moon. So it has something in common with her earlier work as a cartographic draftsperson, But importantly, these drawings are not intended to navigate that surface, so they don't have coordinates or a key. Instead, they're much more concerned with replicating a texture, replicating a topography of a particular landscape. Only here it's the landscape of the moon rather than the landscape of the earth, which she became concerned with subsequently. Also at this time, in the late 60s, Stuart was again traveling. She traveled extensively through the American South and also closer to home. So she made quite a lot of work along the Hudson River, particularly in Kingston, which is up the river from us here at Dia Beacon. When she was producing those kinds of works, she would often collect materials from sites that she had visited, some of them far-flung, some of them closer to home. She would collect earth, which would be displayed in small wooden boxes, and also materials like pebbles, animal bones, feathers, really creating a kind of record of her travels through this act of collecting materials on her journeys. In addition to collecting these materials as a kind of record, she also began to use the process of drawing as a way of recording particular sites. The second image you'll see on the handout is number 5, Moray Hill, New York, from 1973. And this is one of the monumental scrolls that Stuart became known for in the 1970s. So this particular work on the handout is a graphite rubbing. It was made by laying a vast sheet of paper, which was the same size as one of the units of the Fayetteville Strata Quartet, so around 5 feet by 12 feet, unrolling that sheet on the floor. And it was, again, this thick muslin-backed rag paper, sometimes used in map making. And Michelle would then rub the surface of the paper with graphite sticks in order to create a trace of the ground on the surface of the paper. So this process of rubbing a surface with graphite to try and create an impression of it is sometimes described as frottage. It was used specifically by the surrealist artist Max Ernst in a series of works he made in the mid-1920s. Ernst and the Surrealists really thought of frottage as a kind of automatic drawing. That is a type of drawing that bypassed the artist's conscious control. So it was made by the surface being rubbed rather than by the mind of the artist. And we could say that there's something similar in Stuart's work, in that she did talk about taking her own hand out of the drawing, so not wanting to make a signature or autograph of herself, but instead allowing the texture, processes of erosion and sedimentation to leave their trace on the paper. So rather than about accessing the unconscious, it's more about allowing the landscape to imprint itself on the paper. And I've talked about this type of work as being drawn from nature, not in any kind of conventional representational sense, but really as an impression that's lifted from the surfaces of the natural world. So the grid in the moon drawings, which I mentioned previously, indicates a dramatic leap in scale from the vast surface of the moon to these very small scale drawings. But in the scrolls and also in works like this, the scale is much larger, and it's a relationship of 1-to-1 with the site. So rather than being scaled down, it represents an expanse of earth at a scale of 1-to-1. After making these rubbings at locations, often around New York State, Stuart would roll the paper up and transport it to her studio. Then, when it was installed, it would be fixed just at the top. And you can see this here with the Fayetteville Strata Quartet, that the paper is not framed, it's not coated or covered in any way. It's fixed to the wall at the top, and it's then allowed to cascade down onto the floor so that it curls in this seam between the floor and the wall, curling at the viewer's feet. And you can, after the talk, you can come forward and take a closer look. The critic and curator Lawrence Alloway likened these works to waterfalls in the way that they cascaded down the wall. And indeed, there's something much more organic and fluid about this type of installation, as opposed to trying to frame these enormous works. But I think we can also say that the use of this particular space, this seam between the wall and floor, was a recurrent trope in art of the late 1960s onwards. And we can see that here at Dia, particularly in the work of artists like Robert Morris, Richard Serra, and Robert Smithson, whose work you can see here. This transitional space between the wall and the floor was used as a way of drawing attention to the gallery as a kind of architectural container. So drawing attention to the limits of the room and also the world outside of that room. In the work of Smithson in particular, you see him pressing mirrors into this gap between the wall and the floor, and almost optically dissolving the wall, giving a sense of the world beyond. So we can see this curled paper in that particular space as engaging with those minimal and post-minimal strategies. But I think it also does something different that's specific to Michelle's work, which is it draws attention to the horizontal plane, the plane of the ground, on which and from which the whole drawing is generated. So we get the sense that these works are made on the horizontal, on the ground, and then they're hoisted up to the vertical of the wall. So I mentioned a number of artists on display here at Dia who were interested in pointing to the limits of the gallery and also the world beyond the museum, the outdoor world. And this movement, which became known as land art, really gathered ground in the late 60s and early 70s. A lot of the artists worked in very remote locations, so we might think of Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty in the Great Salt Lake in Utah, or Michael Heiser's City in the Nevada desert. But they also worked closer to home, and particularly the post-industrial landscape of New Jersey became a source of fascination for a number of artists working in the 70s. So in 2013, the Princeton University Art Museum held an exhibition specifically about the fascination of New Jersey as a location for artists. The artist Alan Capbrow said that it was fascinating because of its fertility of desolation. And a faint praise, or a backhanded compliment, we might say. But certainly in that exhibition at Princeton, the desolate, derelict, and post-industrial landscape was highlighted as a real site of interest for artists working in New Jersey in the 1970s. Robert Smithson, of course, was born in New Jersey, in Passaic, and he wrote a kind of satirical travelogue to its monuments in 1967. Smithson would bring materials from New Jersey quarries, such as salt, gravel, and rocks, into the gallery and display them either in metal containers or sometimes in conjunction with mirrors. And he called those works non-sites to demonstrate their relationship to the sites from which they were taken. Another artist who made work in New Jersey during this time was Charles Simmons. And you can see a small image of a performance. This is actually a film still, so it's taken from a film of his performance, Landscape Body Dwelling, in 1973. And this work was made at the exact location as the Fayetteville Quarry Quartet. It was made in the Fayetteville Quarry in New Jersey in 1973. So this particular quarry was a source of great interest to Simmons. He described it as a repository for fantasy. Again, he was particularly interested in the fact that it had been an industrial site. So through the 40s and 50s, it had been home to a brick company, the Sayreville Fisher Brick Company, the Sayer and Fisher Brick Company. But by the 70s, only one of the pits was active. And all that was left of the factory was one chimney and a steam shovel that had been left to rust in the quicksand, which was an image, apparently, that was particularly captivating to Robert Smithson with his interest in entropy and decay. So despite its desolate nature, Simmons talked about this space as having a special quality to it, and he made a series of performances there. The one you can see on the handout, Landscape Body Dwelling, is one of a series of works that Simmons made which were centered on an imaginary civilization that he called the Little People. And he would make miniature cities and buildings, in this case on his own body in clay, that he said were inhabited, designed to be inhabited by this imaginary nomadic civilization. So Simmons was interested in the visceral quality of the clay, its softness, its pinkness, and he would perform being born in these clay pits, as well as creating these civilizations in his body. On his body. Interestingly, Smithson and Simmons were friends, and they brought one another to their sites in New Jersey. So Smithson brought Simmons to his site of most interest, which was a stone quarry above Montclair, and they both noted that the black geometric stone at that site had much more in common with Smithson's practice, whereas the pink, sticky quicksand at Fayetteville had much more in common with Simmons' interest in process and in the body. So we can say that the Fayetteville quarry was a particularly fertile site for artists working in the 1970s. And it was actually Simmons and the critic Lucy Lepard who brought Michelle Stuart to the quarry at Fayetteville in 1976. On the front of the handout, you can see an image of Michelle at this site in 76, and also get a sense of the strange, almost lunar or desert-like landscape at the quarry. So Stuart went on to travel extremely widely and to make work in very exotic locations, including the Galapagos Islands, New Zealand, Australia, Scandinavia, Nepal, and Japan. But just like Charles Simmons, she said that there was something unusual about this particular location, the Fayetteville Quarry, and she called it environmentally haunted, like a desert in the middle of New Jersey. In order to capture the particularity of this site, she made a whole series of works there. One of them consists of photographs of the quarry shown in conjunction with a piece of paper rubbed with earth from the site. Another one layers sheets of paper to replicate the strata of the earth that were visible in the quarry. And another one, the small book you can see on your handout, Fragment, Fayetteville, New Jersey, 76, is a book rubbed with earth from that particular site and then bound together with string. This book is one of a series of artist books that Michelle made throughout the 1970s and into the 80s. I think they relate to her long-running interest in the idea of the travelogue or the logbook, but instead of recording her travels in words, they record those travels by sampling material from particular sites, so rubbing the paper with earth from the site and allowing that material to narrate her travels, to narrate the story of her journey. Sometimes the books are bound with string, and sometimes they have objects from the site, such as stones or feathers attached. So this Fragment, Fayetteville, is a smaller work made at the same location. But really the most significant work that Michelle made at the Fayetteville Quarry is the one you can see behind me here, the Fayetteville Strata Quartet. The sheets of paper are the same size as number 5 Moray Hill, which I discussed previously. But in order to capture the particular colours at the site, she shifted her process. So instead of making graphite rubbings that would record the texture of the ground, she took earth from the site and rubbed it into the surface of the paper. You can see this process being enacted on a later work, Colour, Time, Landform Transformations in 1977. I have an image on the handout of that work in process. And you can see that Michelle has laid out the paper, held it in place by rocks, added earth from the site to the surface, and she would then smash and break the rocks and rub them into the surface in a very laborious, labour-intensive, but also very sensual process. She talked about the paper becoming velvety as its fibres were broken down by the rocks, and even about the smell of the minerals as they were broken up and fragmented. So it's a very labour-intensive bodily process. You might wonder how this could be enacted on paper without the paper breaking down. And this is really where this very thick muslin back paper used by map makers comes into play. So it could withstand this rough treatment. But when you look at the surface of the paper closely, which I hope you'll do afterwards, you'll see that it is pitted and undulating. So there's a certain damage to the surface that facilitates the transfer of the pigment. So the surface of the paper is broken down and imbued with earth from the site. The work has a serial structure, so it progresses in 4 parts, and the progression is also one of colour. So it begins with this light, almost flesh tone on the left-hand side, and progresses to a much darker kind of umber on the left. Again, this use of repetition and seriality is something you'll see throughout the displays here at Dia Beacon. For a minimal artist like Donald Judd, organising a work in this way was a way of structuring it without necessarily composing it. And Judd saw this as a way of breaking away from a European mode of balancing and composing the artwork. He talked about it as a kind of regular beat or pulse, one thing after the other. This kind of serial progression was also used by conceptual artists like Sol LeWitt. LeWitt famously described the idea as a kind of machine that makes the art. So once you use this type of programmatic process, the work almost generates itself. And the execution is what LeWitt described as a kind of perfunctory affair. So again, we could say that Stuart has something in common with these artists. She did say that she wanted to remove her hand from the process, but I think she wanted to do that to quite different ends. She certainly wasn't interested in having her work fabricated by anybody else, so she made all of her drawings herself, and the process, as I've described, is very laborious, sometimes to the extent that her hands would actually be bleeding from smashing and rubbing these materials into the surface. So it's a very embodied process that really requires the work of the artist alone, but nevertheless, we could say she's allowing the earth to imprint itself on the paper. So she's trying to take out any kind of signature of herself, but nevertheless through this very intensive process of rubbing. The 4 units of the Fayetteville Strata Quartet also relate to the visible layers of the quarry. So the act of quarrying, the industrial process of quarrying, had exposed rock strata at that site, which all had their own specific depth of colour. So we could say that the 4 strata of the quarry, which she samples here in these different colours of earth, are allowed to generate the structure of the work in a sense. And it's not just a layering in space, but it's also a progression in time. So we might think about our own bodies moving from left to right and seeing these pieces of paper in sequence. but also the processes of sedimentation that had laid down those rock strata, the way in which each strata of earth refers to a particular moment in history, and the act of quarrying unearths those earlier moments in history. Stratification, this idea of layering, is a recurrent theme in Stuart's work. And she's interested not just in physical geological strata, but also in the layered cultural and geographical associations of particular sites. I think a really good example of this is her 1975 work, Niagara Gorge Path Relocated, which you can see also on the handout. This was a piece made at Art Park, which is a state park in Lewiston, New York, that during the 70s and 80s had a residency program for artists. So a lot of artists, including Dennis Oppenheim and Nancy Holt, made work at Art Park. Stuart's piece was a 460-foot-long paper scroll. So if you can imagine one of these 12-foot scrolls, but 460 foot long, that was the work. And it was again rubbed and smashed with earth from that particular site in Lewiston. Again, she used very few helpers for this process, so she was working more or less alone, but she did use some student assistants to help her unfurl this gigantic scroll down the riverbank into the river, and you can see it's the white sheet in the center of the black and white image on your handout. So she was particularly interested in uncovering the history of this site. And indeed, the waterfall-like structure of the drawing spoke to an element of the site's history. So the Niagara Falls, 10,000 years before, had flowed on specifically this site, and gradually through processes of erosion, they had retreated 7 miles to the south. So the waterfall of the paper covers the landscape physically, but it also uncovers this aspect of the site's history, so revealing something that was not necessarily visible on the surface. Michelle was also interested in the cultural history of that site at the Niagara Gorge. It had once been a Native American burial ground, and also the geographical history of it. So it had been previously the location of the Queenston-Lewiston Bridge, which was the primary gateway between the US and Canada in the late 19th century. And in fact, on either side of her drawing, you can see these two pillars. They had been the support pillars of the bridge, which by this point had been taken down and replaced. So we could say that Niagara Gorge Path Relocated functions as a kind of spectre or ghost of the waterfall located on its previous site, but it also points to other multi-layered histories of this location. Instead of creating a kind of permanent monument, like many land artists working at the time, Stuart specified that this scroll should be left to disintegrate in the landscape, saying that it would enter into a kind of union with the land that had generated it. Here I think she might have been interested in Jorge Luis Borges' short story on exactitude in science, which is a short story about map making. It tells the story of a guild of map makers that wanted a map so precise that they made it the exact scale of the empire that it represented. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, it was found to be completely useless and rather kind of ungainly. And the story ends with the map being allowed to disintegrate. Borges says, remnants of it can still be seen in the deserts of the West. So I think that the idea of this huge scroll being left to disintegrate might engage with that short story by Borges. It also adds an element of biodegradability to the work that is really at odds, I think a striking juxtaposition with other works of land art. So rather than permanently moulding or inscribing the landscape, Stuart's works leave very little trace on its surface. Now, I mentioned previously Stuart's engagement with the feminist movement in the 1970s, and I wanted now to talk a little bit about feminism and its relationship to ecology at that time, because I think it relates to a number of very pressing concerns today. So in 1976, the year that she produced the Fayetteville Strata Quartet, Stuart was one of the founders of the Heresies Collective, which was a feminist collective that published the journal Heresies for 16 years, beginning in 1977. On the handout, you'll see the front cover of an issue of Heresies from 1981. This issue was entitled Earth Keeping, Earth Shaking, Feminism and Ecology. And it really considered the relationship between feminism and eco-politics at this point in 1981. On the cover of the journal, the editors, led by Lucy Lepard, chose to have an image of Mount St. Helens, the volcano that had erupted the previous year in Washington state. And they said that they used this image to symbolize a revolt of nature, the sense that nature was in revolution against human intervention. Specifically in the editorial statement in 1981, Lepard and the other editorial group asked what women could do about the disastrous direction the world is taking. And particularly, they said, the US government's emphasis on militarism and militarism at the expense of social services and the environment. So these concerns voiced about the Reagan administration in '81 sound very relevant, sadly, to us today. Stuart contributed a logbook to this issue of Heresies magazine, and it was titled Logbook for Disgrace, which was a play on the book Logbook for Grace, published by the naturalist Robert Cushman Murphy in 1913. And that logbook detailed a whaling expedition. So again, we can see this recurrent interest in logbooks and in travelogues that runs throughout Michelle's practice. But her logbook, the Logbook for Disgrace, rather than documenting a specific expedition, documented a series of catastrophic accidents or attacks on the natural world by humankind. It began in 1593 with the clubbing of thousands of penguins by sailors of the ship Desire that had docked near Tierra del Fuego off the southernmost tip of South America. And this is a true story that Stuart logs in her logbook. So the captain of the ship Desire, his sailors having slaughtered thousands of penguins, ordered that they should be dried and salted and brought on board the ship. But they then bred maggots that turned out to gnaw through human flesh and even wood, incapacitating most of the crew by the time the ship reached its final destination at Bantry Bay in Ireland. So this is a kind of revolt of nature of the type symbolized by Mount St. Helens on the front cover of this issue of Heresies. So Stuart began with that entry in her logbook, and she then logged a whole series of oil spills that had occurred in the 20th century, concluding with two that had occurred recently in the 70s at Bantry Bay in Ireland. She noted with some irony that the Gulf Oil Corporation had chosen for its location in Ireland the precise site of the cemetery of the sailors from the ship Desire. So inflicting new damage on the site of those old scars, but perhaps also inviting another revolt of nature of the type discussed throughout this issue of Heresies. So this impact of humans on the earth and its ecosystems, detailed in Stuart's logbook for Disgrace, and also in this issue of Heresies on feminism and ecology, relates to recent debates on the Anthropocene, which is a term that's been popularized in recent years, particularly since its use by the Nobel Prize-winning scientist Paul Crutzen in the year 2000. Anthropocene refers to the age of man, and it's been proposed to describe a new geological epoch, which is defined precisely by human rather than natural influence upon the Earth. Geological epochs are defined not by dates, but by boundaries between rock strata, specifically the kind of strata that Michelle was documenting in her Fayetteville Strata Quartet. So stratigraphy, or the study of the Earth's strata, and also their relationship to geological timescale, is fundamental to recent debates, which you may have seen in the news, surrounding whether we can now be said to be in the Anthropocene as opposed to the Holocene, which is the previous geological era. So to say that we're now in the Anthropocene is to acknowledge that human activities such as mining, quarrying, dam building, deforestation, and the bottom trawling of the earth, of the ocean have now come to surpass non-human forces on the Earth's surface. And I think there are some interesting connections between these debates on the Anthropocene and land art, because much land art of the 60s and 70s participated in the anthropogenic or human modification of the Earth. In an article entitled Aligned with Nazca, the land artist, well, he worked across a whole variety of media, but at this time, Robert Morris was making land art, and he linked land art to the ancient geoglyphs in the Nazca Desert, the Nazca lines, as part of a persistent human desire to inscribe and modify the landscape. Michael Heiser's northeast-southwest, which you can see here on display at Dia Beacon, was initially conceived as 4 pits in the Nevada mountains. And he did execute 2 of them, north and south, which are geometric forms cut into the earth. In Heiser's work, this led to some very substantial modifications of the Earth. So his work, Double Negative, but also City, inscribe and modify the Earth to such an extent that they can actually be seen by satellite. So we could say that Heiser's work exposes the anthropogenic modification of the Earth's surface, but it also participates in that modification. It contributes to it without necessarily critiquing this desire to inscribe the Earth and leave a signature upon it. By contrast, I think we could say that Stuart's work is receptive rather than inscriptive. It allows the Earth to leave traces on works like the Fayetteville Strata Quartet, rather than Stuart inscribing her own mark on the surface of the planet. So in this sense, I think we can say that it relates to recent debates around Anthropocene feminism. The cultural critic Claire Colebrook, writing on this term, has asked if the planet has been scarred to the point of being geologically readable, who is the author of those inscriptions and who is their future reader? I want to conclude now by discussing some of Stuart's more recent work, and you'll see that the last image on the handout is Land, Space, Time from 2011. Since 2010, Stuart has worked predominantly with photography, specifically in photo grids. So these are individual photographs, but they're arranged in a grid, and there are resonances and narratives between the individual images displayed in this way. This gridded structure can, of course, be traced right back to the moon drawings of the late 1960s. So we see the cartographer's grid as a recurrent and consistent interest in Michelle's work. And we also see other recurrent themes. So they're pretty small on the handout, but a lot of these photographic images record geoglyphs, inscriptions on the earth of the type of the Nazca lines. And here in Land, Space, Time, Stuart depicts those geoglyphs in conjunction with flying machines designed to view the Earth from above or to travel above the Earth's surface. So here you may find them difficult to see, but there is a biplane, a human-powered aircraft, a hot air balloon, a blimp, and a space shuttle. And we see these aircraft positioned above geoglyphs and the landscapes in these modified archival photographs. So I think we could say that a work like Land, Space, Time documents this imperialistic inscription and surveillance of the planet, so the urge to mark the planet, but also to view those marks from above. And in this sense, it relates again back to the moon drawings, the surveillance of the moon by NASA that generated those photographic images from which Stuart worked with those drawings in the late 60s. But if you look at several of these flying machines, particularly the human-powered aircraft visible in the lower right-hand corner, they often seem to be at an unrealistic altitude, so they appear somewhat imperiled, lost, or fragile. So unlike much land art, which reiterates and even celebrates human power over the earth, I think we could conclude by saying that Stuart's work emphasizes a certain ecological vulnerability. Works like Land, Space, Time recognize that humans are vulnerable not only because of our individual mortality, but also because our survival as a species depends on complex macro and micro ecologies, all of which are themselves vulnerable to harm. When Stuart described the Fayetteville quarry as environmentally haunted, she captivated the spectral layering of multiple histories at that site, but also the way in which this post-industrial landscape was haunted by the human exploitation of the Earth's resources at that particular site of quarrying. Thank you. We have time for questions, so please go ahead.
Many things, but Michelle's complete comfort with great scale. To the moon, grand Niagara Falls, and the most tiny, intimate stone, leaf, seed, saved, transported, and shown. She not only does it, she says, look, it's very beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Just in case. Okay. Anna, I was wondering if you could please talk a little bit about your interest in this artist with respect to your larger project. How does she fit into your thinking on drawing in a larger scale?
Yeah, so I think I came to Michelle's work through my interest in drawing in the 60s and 70s, and I've become particularly concerned with the way in which artists at that time seem to negate certain presumptions about drawing, particularly the idea that drawing is expressive, autographic, and also the idea that it's intimate, that it's a kind of disclosure, and that it's small scale. So I began to look at artists who oppose the small scale with a very large scale, but who also, as Michelle has once said, took themselves out of the process. So although these drawings may have been made by hand, they weren't intended to read as a kind of signature of an individual. And I've tried to describe today how, despite the labor-intensive process of making a drawing like this, Michelle wouldn't have wanted to have seen herself stamped all over the drawing. But I do think there's a trend in land art to stamp the self on the earth, and I think Michelle's work works in opposition to that desire.
Is that phenomenon cut off in 1980?
Well, I've been focusing predominantly on about 1966 to 1976. In 1976, there was a major exhibition at MoMA called Drawing Now, which really rendered all of the practices that I've been writing about canonical. But it was said, even by critics at that point, that this was already drawing then. And typically, you know, by the time a major museum exhibits something, it's often not the most contemporary thing that's happening. So I think by the mid-70s, you start to see alternative trends in drawing. And I think Michelle's engagement with nature is very different to that post-minimal drawing of the 60s and 70s, and shows a practice that's developing in a new direction. Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit more about using the word surveillance to the recent works? And would that have been a term you used 15 years ago to describe any of Michelle's work?
Sorry, the term surveillance, the surveillance. Yeah, I think in a sense, we could think about the moon landing and the desire to explore space, and certainly the space race in terms of the Cold War, and a drive to survey the landscape and to survey planets beyond our own, and a competition to do so. Also, when you look at those photographs that NASA took, they are very kind of scientific, very distant. Lawrence Alloway even said that some of Michelle's drawings looked as though you were viewing the lunar surface through an infrared sensor. So there's a sense of surveillance about that aerial view, which we also see, of course, in the new topographics photography in the 70s, this idea that photographing the Earth from the air can often relate to militaristic uses of photography and surveillance. So that's where I was thinking from in relation to the moon drawings. In this recent work, Land, Space, Time, I think it's the fact that you have these viewing machines or flying machines juxtaposed with the Earth. So there's this movement between inscription, the inscription of the Earth, and the viewing, the surveillance of the Earth. And it's very much about seeing man positioned above the Earth's surface, looking down.
I have a question about the installation of the work itself and the choice of, are those nails that are penetrating the paper, and what is the significance?
The works, Alexis might say more about this afterwards, but the works are always displayed in this way, so this isn't particular to Dia. They're pinned at the top and allowed to fall down. And again, that's to do with creating this sense that they're in the viewer's space. There's no pedestal, no frame separating our space from the space of the drawing. And it really gives a sense of their delicacy. In terms of the specific installation at Dia, I don't know if you wanted to say anything else.
I'd just add that they're penetrating the paper, but the paper has grommets in them, which reinforce those holes, so they're quite stable. The paper's not likely to break because of its own weight on them, and that's something that Michelle has put into each of these pieces. So again, speaking to the deliberate nature of the form of installation.
The paper is surprisingly tough. Like, it's certainly not undamageable, but it's much thicker than conventional paper, and it has this muslin back to it. So it could withstand being taken out, being bashed, and kind of have rocks smashed into it. And then often they would be stored rolled up. So the way in which they're stored and displayed and handled really goes against a lot of our expectations about how paper and drawing might be treated. And as I mentioned, they're always nailed to the top, and there are grommets to facilitate that type of installation.
I have a question for you, and maybe for Michelle as well, which is, we talk about land art, which isn't really that discrete a category. I mean, they're kind of one wave and then a second wave that emerges in the 70s. And so I just wonder what Michelle's relationship to land art as a sort of movement or a genre was, and whether she was thinking about her work deliberately in terms of that group.
Was that a question?
Yeah. Were you?
I didn't hear the question. What's your relationship
To land art.
Do you see yourself as a land artist, or were you thinking that at the time?
You know, I don't think that I thought about it. I mean, honestly, I never particularly like categories and groupings, and that can work for you and against you. You know, it gives you a certain freedom, because then you aren't like engaged with a point of view. I think they belong in that vast category of works that work with the land. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say about that, really. I'm not sure. I mean, I did outdoor works that used boulders, you know, but I thought, first of all, I thought Anna's talk was really good. I mean, really well thought out, and, you know, I usually criticize talks when I hear them, and there wasn't one criticism, actually, that even occurred to me. You know, everyone that gets involved with your work has his or her own point of view, and I, you know, think that hers is a good point of view. But, you know, so I was thinking as you were talking, somebody else could come along and take a different point of view, and that's what this course is all about, and that's what's so interesting about art, because, you know, each person brings this whole panoply of ideas and, you know, presents them, and you think, yeah, you know, you learned something. I mean, I learned something listening to her. You know, I mean, one would think that the artist sits there and says, oh, yeah, you know, but no, you really learn something that you haven't. It's not that you didn't know it, you hadn't really profoundly thought about it, you know. And so, yes, it's, I guess anything using the land is land art, isn't it? But you could put it in a lot of other categories too. I mean, it could be painting. You know, it's using color, it's on the wall. You know, one of the things that I found engaging with, you know, when I was doing these is that they draw the person in physically. And I always was very, I mean, that was part of the reason I had them, some came in much further into the viewer's space. And I felt that kind of brought us into a view of the land, or the surface of the land, or the color of the land, physically. You know, unlike looking at a painting of a landscape, which is apart from you. You know, this you actually participate in. So that was one thing that I was thinking, you know, that could be said about this piece, and even more so about, you know, a piece that came in like 10 feet. But I've babbled long enough. So.
Well, I would say on that note, thank you. I think we all learned